I was 55 the night our last border train left the yard, with one extra body on the manifest and one missing at the final stop. I checked his ticket, looked him in the eye, and locked his suitcase myself. By dawn, the company swore he'd stepped off at the border like he was supposed to. My log says he didn't. Everything else in this story hangs on that gap between what the system insists happened and what I remember with my own hands. Before that night, the line was just work. A night train that slipped across a border most people saw as a darker stretch of countryside. I knew the timings by feel, when the brakes test would hiss through the train, when the yard lights would fade, when the first drunk commuter would miss the last local and end up with us. My name was on the duty roster, the manifest, the safety checks, but in my head I was just the one who walks the train. We'd been told weeks earlier that the line was being cut. The notice went up in the crew room without ceremony, a sheet of paper, the end date printed in a font that didn't care. I did the math automatically. How many more night shifts? How many hours left to reach the pension threshold? 55 is an awkward age to start over. The company didn't say that in the memo. Every shift started the same way. I walked the length of the train, checking doors, feeling for loose latches. I watched the brake test like I'd watched it 1,000 times. Air hissing through the lines, the slight shudder as pressure settled. I ticked the small box on the form that said brakes checked, printed my initials beside it. It's a small movement, that hook of the pen, considering what depends on it. The passengers came in waves. Backpackers with tangled hair and crumpled tickets, factory workers, students, older couples who still preferred trains to planes. You don't hold every face. You hold patterns, the way some people hover at the door like they're afraid of missing the train, the way others act like the whole system exists to wait for them. A few people did stand out, if only because they came back often enough to become background. He was one of those. Medium height, narrow shoulders, a face that could be any age between 40 and 60. Clean, quiet, never drunk, never a problem. His tickets were always in order, his passport already open at the right page well before I reached him. If his eyes had a color, I couldn't tell you now. What I remember is the suitcase. It was a brown suitcase that might once have looked respectable. By the time I noticed it, the corners were worn soft, the fake leather peeling in strips, the handle wrapped in gray tape to keep it from tearing off. It was heavier than it looked. Every time he lifted it into the rack, there was a half second where his arm gave out, and I caught the weight before it dropped. The suitcase didn't clink or rattle. It just dragged straight down through my wrist, the way a bag of wet sand does. On the night of the last train, he was there again, in the same coach he always used. I scanned his ticket, saw his name pop up where I expected it on the handheld screen, matched to the bunk I could have pointed to with my eyes closed. I checked his passport, saw the familiar pattern of stamps back and forth across the border. I nodded him through, watched him wheel the suitcase down the narrow corridor, pivot it into his compartment with a practiced tilt. Once we left the departure station, the cabin lights dimmed to that soft yellow that never lets your eyes rest. The air inside the train took on its usual thickness, old upholstery, cheap coffee, traces of perfume and engine oil. I did my first pass of the train, scanning tickets, checking that people were in the right beds, answering the same questions I'd been answering for years. What time will we get there? Will the border police wake us up? Is it safe to sleep with the door unlocked? When I passed his door again, he'd already folded himself onto the lower bunk, back turned towards the corridor, shoes placed neatly side by side on the floor. The brown suitcase sat in the dark rectangle under the bed. It looked like it always did. The only thing different that night was the date printed on the notice in the crew room and the number in my head counting backwards from enough to almost out beyond the double-glazed windows. The line curved towards the section of track everyone pretended not to think about, the one where the derailment had ripped through a night, not so different from this one. If you'd asked me then, I would have said I'd made my peace with it, that whatever investigation there had been was over, that my job was to get people across this stretch of country without making eye contact with history. I had no reason yet to slow down when I passed his compartment. No reason yet to remember the exact weight of that suitcase in my hand. By the time we reached the border station that night, most of the coach was half awake. The rhythm of the train changed a few kilometers out. Less sway, more brake, a subtle slowing regular passengers felt in their stomach. People sat up, patted pockets, checked passports, tickets, phones. Border platforms always looked more like loading bays than places for people. Floodlights on high poles, fences and signs and cameras all pointed at the thin strip of platform where the train doors would open. A few border officers waited where they always did, jackets zipped, coffee cups steaming in their hands. He was in his usual coach, in his usual lower bunk. The brown suitcase sat under the bed where I'd seen it a dozen times. He was dressed, jacket on, shoes tied, passport open. When I slid the compartment door back, he looked up once, then down at the documents between his hands. "Off here again?" I asked, because that's what I always asked. He nodded once. Here. If there was anything strange about him that night, I didn't see it. He didn't seem anxious, or drunk, or ill. He didn't ask for help with the suitcase. When he pulled it out from under the bunk, he braced his knees the way he always did and let the weight find its balance before he straightened. I stepped back to give him space in the narrow corridor. At the door, the air from the platform came in colder and flatter than the air inside the train. People bunched up without meaning to. I checked tickets, glanced at faces, matched them against the handheld screen. His name was there, highlighted, marked to disembark at this station. When he reached me, he held out his ticket and passport together. I scanned, heard the small confirmation beep, saw the status flip to boarding complete, exit here for a second. I thought about saying his name out loud. It was a middling name, common enough to vanish in a list. I let it stay on the screen. I stepped aside and watched him angle the suitcase through the doorway, down onto the platform. He didn't look back up at me. Border checks take time. I stayed by the door until the last marked passenger stepped down, then walked the platform alongside the train, counting doors and clusters of people. If you'd asked me then whether I saw him on the platform, I'd have said yes. Memory works in patterns. Inside the station office, the light felt too white after the train. The duty officer on that shift had a screen with the live feed from the platform cameras and another with a copy of our manifest. I gave him my handheld so he could match our list with his, carriage by carriage. He asked the usual questions. Any disturbances on board? Any passengers ill or unaccounted for? Any issues with documents? I answered the way I always did when nothing obvious had gone wrong. Then he frowned at his screen. "You've got one more name here than bodies I've got on the count," he said, tilting the monitor so I could see without making it look like an accusation. "Says here he's supposed to get off at the border. My people don't remember seeing him." He read out the name. It matched the name I'd seen on the handheld, tied to the lower bunk in the familiar suitcase. For a second, my mind shuffled through possibilities and tried to make the numbers work. The officer clicked a different camera angle. Grainy black and white images of the platform came up, slightly delayed, time-stamped. He ran back the footage from our arrival until a figure with a rectangular suitcase moved through the frame. The shape could have been his. The suitcase, right in outline. "Could be him," the officer said. "Hard to tell. Cameras are no good at faces at this angle." He let it hang there. The manifest on one screen, the blurred frame on the other. "He usually gets off here," I heard myself say. "He had his things ready." I scanned him out. The officer nodded slowly. "Then we'll mark him as offloaded at the border," he said. "System likes things to match." He turned the screen back towards himself, opening the form for confirming departures. A list of names, each with a box beside it. Some already ticked, some waiting. My man's name sitting there, expectant. "Just confirm that's correct and we're done," he said. He didn't hand me a pen. I looked at the blurred image on the camera feed again, then at the manifest, then at the memory in my own head of the man stepping past me with the suitcase. If you listen to enough safety briefings, you start to hear the same sentence. To the best of my recollection, it builds a fence around what you think you know. Standing in that office, I could feel it lining up before I opened my mouth. To the best of my recollection, he stepped off at the border with his suitcase and joined the others on the platform. That's what I said. That's what I let the system record when I approved the form. One click. One more small confirmation in a life full of them. Later, when I thought back to that night, I couldn't say for certain whether I'd seen him stand there on the concrete or whether I'd only seen the shape the cameras offered me and decided it was close enough. By the time we rolled into the final station, the sky over the yards had gone the color of old dishwater. I stood at the coach door while people climbed down with stiff legs and heavy bags, counted bodies, then turned back inside to make sure the sleeper was empty. Walk the corridor, check the doors, make sure nobody is still flat on their back with earplugs in, heading for the depot instead of the city. I started from the far end, tugging curtains back a hand's width, listening for sounds. Someone is still there. His compartment door rested against the latch, caught halfway. Inside, the lower bunk was a hollow in the mattress, the sheet twisted, the blanket shoved to the foot. The pillow still held the shallow dip of a head. Under the bunk, in the dark slot between the legs and the wall, sat the brown suitcase with the taped handle, exactly where it had been when we left the border. There were no shoes beside the bed, no coat on the hook, no bag on the little metal shelf. I bent down, wrapped my hand around the handle, and lifted a little. The tape rasped against my skin. The weight dragged at my wrist in the same familiar way. Anyone passing the door would have assumed the owner was in the washroom or already on the platform. I checked the rest of the coach because habit is stubborn. A paperback lay face down on one pillow. A bottle rolled on the floor. When I stepped back towards the door, the coach finally felt empty. My handheld buzzed at my hip. The passenger list for my coach filled the small screen. Names, berths, status fields. Most entries now showed arrived. A few were marked border. His line was one of those. According to the system, he had stepped off at the border station hours earlier. The count of occupied berths matched the count on the screen. In one corner of the display, a small icon waited for times when something did not line up. Item left on board. Passenger status uncertain. Comments. I watched it for a moment, thumb hovering over the glass, then backed out of the menu. Once you press the flag, you stop being a tired conductor and become part of a file. The radio on my shoulder crackled. "Conductor, confirm your coaches are clear," dispatch said. "Any luggage to record." "One unclaimed suitcase from the sleeper," I said, "tagged to a passenger. The system already shows as having left at the border." Static blurred the reply into 3 short instructions. Tag it. Send it to Lost and Found. Close the run. I carried the suitcase down the steps. It pulled at my shoulder when I helped him lift it into the rack. The platform concrete was cold under my boots. The Lost and Found room sat off a staff corridor, behind a door. Inside, metal shelves held umbrellas, shopping bags, backpacks with half-broken zippers. A clerk glanced up as I came in. "Another one from the sleeper?" she asked. "Tag says border," I said, holding the handle up for her to see. "I'm just dropping it on the shelf." She shrugged and went back to her screen. I slid the brown suitcase into an empty slot, wrote his name and my coach number on a tag, and tied it around the taped handle until the cardboard crease dug into the gray edge. Back in the crew office, The logbook lay open on the counter. The page for our run was ruled into neat sections. Arrival time, delay, incidents. I put the lost and found chit beside it and uncapped my pen. My hand knew how to write my name. The blank space was for the sentence that would attach to it. If I wrote passenger missing, luggage left on board, this shift would stop being one more night in a long line. There would be calls and questions. Maybe someone asking why I had not said anything at the border when the camera picture was already fuzzy enough. If I wrote nothing, the suitcase would sink into the heap of lost property, anonymous until a deadline arrived and it was sent on. In the end, I wrote that a suitcase from the sleeper had been transferred to Lost and Found, and that, according to recorded data, its owner had disembarked at the border station. It was technically correct. It was also the version that matched the screen in the security room and the quiet wish of everyone higher up the chain for numbers that behaved. I signed under the line in the space reserved for the conductor. When I closed the book, the covers met with a small dry thud. On paper, the run was complete. The figures agreed. The only place they did not fit was in the gap between the empty bunk in my memory and the suitcase I had just helped the railway forget. For a couple of days, I tried to let the suitcase join the background noise. Lost property is constant. People leave umbrellas, forget backpacks, abandon grocery bags when they sprint for connections. Most of it has no story beyond bad timing. That is what I told myself each time the brown case rose up in my mind. Off shift, it followed me anyway, just as a small, steady thought at odd hours. An empty bunk, a full suitcase, a line on a screen that said border, and a log entry that did not say what I had seen. I had worked long enough to know the system rarely went hunting for trouble on its own. It waited for someone lower down to name it. On my next night run, I walked the usual path off the train. I stopped at the lost and found door before I checked my locker. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cleaning fluid. Metal shelves ran along the walls, loaded with whatever the railway had swallowed that week. Coats and plastic covers. Shopping bags that still crinkled when you touched them. The brown case sat where I had left it, its tag softened at the edges. My own handwriting fading where the pen had scratched into the cardboard. "You missing something?" a cleaner asked from the doorway. "Just checking a tag," I said, keeping my eyes on the suitcase. I pushed the door until it was almost closed. It did not lock, but it dulled the corridor noise. For a moment, I simply stood in front of the suitcase, waiting for habit or fear to tell me to leave it alone. Nothing useful turned up. The latches were old metal. They gave way under my thumbs with a dull click. When I lifted the lid, the smell that rose was mainly paper. On one side, shirts and underwear were folded in a plain stack. On the other, the space was packed tight with documents. Folders, plastic sleeves, loose sheets slid in wherever there was room. Dates and short notes were written on the tabs in a small, controlled hand. At the top of the first folder lay a copy of an internal assessment from the year of the derailment on our line. I recognized the company logo and the way the paragraphs marched down the page. Buried in the text was a sentence I had heard repeated in briefings and training modules. No clear evidence of systemic failure identified at this stage. On the printed copy in the suitcase, someone had underlined that line 3 times. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave a ridge on the back of the page. Deeper down, the file changed. There were maintenance reports from before the accident, written by depot staff and drivers. They spoke, in cautious language, about slightly longer braking distances on wet nights and a familiar curve that felt sharper than the timetable wanted to admit. Attached to some of them were recommendations to slow trains on that stretch until upgrades could be done. Beside those recommendations lay replies from people further up the chain. The words were polite, full of thanks and reassurances. Phrases about budget cycles and future reviews appeared again and again. On their own, They read like routine management noise. Knowing what happened later on that same piece of track, they sounded thinner. Under the reports, someone had placed black and white photographs on cheap copier paper. In them, our train lay twisted along the ballast, windows gone, carriages leaning at bad angles. You could see the curve itself, chewed and scarred, the ballast kicked out where steel had gone sideways instead of straight. Some letters had been sent and copied before they left. Parents wrote about children who had never come home. Partners cataloged injuries. They asked why earlier warnings had not been acted on, why their complaints had been folded into a statement about tragedy. My name did not appear anywhere in those papers. I was not senior enough back then to be copied in. Still, the whole pile felt closer to my job than the official story did. Someone had spent years assembling this archive, carrying it up and down our line in that battered case, trusting the same trains that had failed them once to keep bringing them back. I repacked everything as neatly as I could. Clothes first, then folders, then the photographs and letters sandwiched in the middle where they would not tear. The suitcase closed with a small resistance, as if the paper had grown. I pushed the latches down and felt them bite. The archive stayed where the company liked problems best, off the main routes, behind a plain door, waiting. When I stepped back into the corridor, the station sounded normal again. Trolleys rattled. A coffee machine hissed. On the union board by the staff entrance, someone had pinned a leaflet about fatigue and reporting safety concerns. I had walked past that kind of paper for years without stopping. This time, with the smell of dust and toner still in my nose, the words looked less like slogans and more like a dare. Knowing what lay inside the suitcase made it harder to treat my part in the official story. Doors closed. Tickets tore. Bunks were made and stripped. Underneath, one thought kept circling. If someone had carried all that paper up and down the line for years, what exactly had the rest of us been carrying? When colleagues mentioned the derailment, I heard them differently. Some skipped past the year. Others used the phrases from training slides. All procedures were followed. One of them said, "Sometimes there is nothing anyone can do." I had spoken those lines myself, letting them smooth over whatever I did not want to look at. Opening the suitcase in the lost and found room would have drawn attention. So, on a later run, I signed the case out on a vague security pretext and took it into a small service compartment at the end of my coach. Passengers never see that room. It is narrow, with a fold-down seat, a shelf, and a window. I set the suitcase on the seat, shut the door, and opened the latches. The coach swayed in the rhythm I knew. Outside was dark. Inside was paper. This time I sorted instead of skimming. Maintenance reports, staff feedback, risk assessments, and post-accident analysis. Dates ran across the tops of pages. Weeks before the derailment, drivers had logged small warnings about the feel of the brakes on the nightline and about a curve on the border side that wanted more time than the schedule allowed. Stapled to some of those notes were recommendations from technical staff. Reduce speed on that stretch until components could be replaced. Adjust running time to allow for slower braking. Increase checks. Next to them sat replies from higher desks, with thanks and talk of budgets and future reviews. After the accident, different teams had gone over the same curve with cooler language. Speed profiles, stopping distances, weight calculations. They broke the night into seconds and meters, drawing lines through the same warnings that had first appeared as staff feedback. On paper, hindsight looked neat. In that room, with the train moving over the same rails, it did not. Under those charts sat a photocopied form I recognized before I read the title. It was the standard pre-departure safety checklist, printed for a night run on our line from the year of the derailment. The header carried the train number, the station pair, and a departure time that belonged to my old night turn. Each safety task had a small box beside it. Door checks, emergency equipment, Communication test. Brake test. Next to each line were initials. Some belonged to people I barely knew. Others to names I had only ever seen on notices. Halfway down the page, beside visual confirmation of brake test, a compact pair of letters sat neatly on the line. The curve of the first, the way it hooked into the second, stopped me. I had been writing that pair since my first week on the job. I checked the header again. The shift code matched the rotation I had been on. The date sat inside the week when those recommendations to slow trains should have mattered most. The route printed at the top was the one I could still run in my head. You tick the box because not ticking it holds up a train or invites a conversation you do not have time for. Looking at my initials on that photocopy gave the habit a weight it had never had while I was leaning on the counter with a pen. When the company later said all required checks had been completed, this was one of the pieces of paper they meant. When they told families and inspectors that procedures had been followed, the small box with my letters in it helped hold up that sentence. Nobody had needed to lie. They had only needed people like me to keep signing. I put the documents back in order, slower than I had pulled them out. Reports and feedback, then graphs, then the photocopy of the checklist with my initials ringed in my head. The latches on the suitcase closed with a soft metal snap. Somewhere the train carried me over the same curve that had shaken itself into all those diagrams. I did not look out of the window. I could feel the lean in my knees as we passed it. Before that night, the derailment had been something that happened to other people, on a shift that belonged to the company. By the time I carried the suitcase back to its shelf, the question in my head had changed. It was no longer what did they hide from us, but what did I help them say, by doing my job and not asking for a different line on the form. Sleep used to come easily after a night run. You go home, you shower, you eat something bland and too late, and your body folded in on itself without asking your head. After I found my initials on that brake test form, the routine slipped. I would lie down and feel the pen in my hand, feel the tick in the box like a weight at my wrist. The questions followed me back onto the train. On my next shift, I found myself standing longer in front of the union board by the crew room door. Pieces of paper had been pinned there for months. Bargaining updates, rota changes, a faded poster about mental health. Tucked between them, half hidden by a newer notice on holiday rosters, was the leaflet about fatigue and safety concerns I had walked past so often. I peeled it back from the pin and read it for the first time. The promises were neat. No retaliation for good faith reports. Confidential channels. Support if you are worried about the safety of your train. The sentences sounded like they belonged to another industry, one where time and money did not lean so hard on people whose names never made it onto statements. In the break room, an older conductor sat with a mug cupped in both hands. He had been around for the derailment year. We had swapped stories about late buses and broken vending machines. Never about that night. I sat down opposite him with the leaflet still in my hand. I did not ask him directly if he trusted the safety system. Instead, I asked what he remembered about the way the accident had been explained to staff. He stared into his drink for a moment, then said they had given them a briefing, some slides, a few phrases to use with passengers if they asked. Then he shrugged and said he had gone back to work because that was what you did. Before he left the room, he tapped the leaflet with one finger and told me that protocols were one thing on paper and another thing once people started worrying about their mortgage. It was the closest he came to an opinion. It was enough. Later, between ticket checks, I sat in a corner of the staff office and tried the internal safety line. A recorded voice thanked me for calling and listed my options. Report an immediate hazard. Raise a concern about equipment. Ask a question about fatigue policy. There was no button for years old, paperwork in a suitcase, and a man who had gone missing in a system that said he was gone. I hung up before the tone. Leaving a message that vague would have created a file I could not control. Instead, I logged into the booking system and searched for the passenger I knew only as a face and a surname on my roster. Recent bookings appeared without trouble. Older journeys blurred into anonymized codes. Whatever he had done 15 years ago on this line lived on in records I did not have clearance to see. In the corner of the screen, another menu waited. For lost property records. I checked the entry for the suitcase I had taken off the train. It showed the date, the coach number, my initials again, and a status, unclaimed. No cross-reference to the derailment. No link to safety. Nothing to say that inside it lay a different version of the company's sentence. By the end of the week, I had spoken to a union representative. If you can call 3 minutes a conversation. I mentioned that I had questions about an old safety checklist and whether there was any point bringing something like that forward. He looked at me, as if trying to decide how seriously I meant it, then said that grievances were possible but that reopening old cases tended to go nowhere and could make life uncomfortable. He did not tell me not to do it. He did tell me to think about what I wanted the outcome to be and whether I was prepared to have my name in any paperwork that might follow. When he walked away, he left the leaflet folded on my locker where I could not miss it again. Nothing in those days counted as a grand act. I had not filed a complaint, not flagged a missing passenger, not accused anyone of anything. All I had done was read, ask, listen, and try a door to see which ones were bolted from the inside. It was more movement than I had managed in the years when I let the company's story do my thinking for me. What stayed with me most was not the words on the posters or the recorded reassurances on the phone. It was the simple fact that every route towards saying something came with a quiet reminder of what it might cost. Between the right to stay silent and the right to speak without being buried, there was gray space where people like me were expected to stand and make peace with ourselves. The point where thinking about something ends and doing it is not marked on any timetable. For me, it arrived on a Tuesday morning between 2 ordinary tasks, checking a roster change on the notice board and initialing a line in a logbook. My pen paused over the paper and refused to move. The small act of not signing felt louder than anything I could have said. Instead of finishing the line, I sat down at the computer in the corner of the crew room and opened a blank internal message form. I typed 3 words, deleted them, then typed 4 different ones. In the end, I wrote something that could live, even if the email was forwarded, a request for guidance about a safety checklist and a discrepancy between recorded procedures and later findings. I attached nothing. I did not mention the suitcase or the man who had carried it. I referenced the year of the derailment and our line in general terms, said I had recently reviewed an old document that raised questions, and asked which department handled such matters now that the formal investigation was long closed. When I hit send, the message left without ceremony, a small packet of doubt traveling into the system that had been so sure of itself in public. Doors still closed. I took my turns and tried not to fix my eyes on a particular shelf every time I passed the lost and found door. When the safety office finally called me, it was on a day off. The number that flashed on my phone was unfamiliar. The voice on the other end was calm, neither hostile nor warm. They thanked me for taking safety seriously, reminded me that the investigation into the derailment had been completed years ago, and asked in careful language what exactly I believed was wrong with the record. I told them only what I could afford to put my name under, that a pre-departure checklist from that period existed with my initials on the brake test line. That subsequent analysis of the accident pointed to braking and speed on a particular curve as contributing factors. That maintenance reports from before the accident suggested concerns that did not seem fully reflected in the conclusions. I framed it as confusion rather than accusation. The person on the line listened, then slipped into a tone I recognized from statements and briefings. Any new concerns would have to be assessed carefully, given the age of the incident. They mentioned legal advice, liability, and avoiding speculation. At the same time, they invited me, if I wished, to put my thoughts in writing so they could be logged formally. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and wrote an account. I described my role at the time in pre-departure checks, the discovery of my initials on the old form, and the existence of a passenger who had repeatedly traveled our line carrying a suitcase full of documents related to the derailment. I did not say where the suitcase was. I did not describe every paper inside it. I did, however, make one link that could not be undone once it was read. I stated that the unclaimed luggage from my coach contained material suggesting that some families and staff believed earlier warnings had been ignored or minimized. A few days later, I was asked to speak with a manager and a representative from the safety team in a small office off the main corridor. The room smelled of printer, toner, and instant coffee. There was a closed file on the table. A glass of water set out as if they expected bad news. They let me talk first. I went through the same sequence as in my statement, keeping my voice flat and my phrases modest. When I finished, the manager folded his hands and said he appreciated my concern and my honesty. Then he asked if I understood that revisiting settled events could open up difficult questions for a lot of people, including me. No one threatened me. No one shouted. The pressure sat in the spaces between phrases. We have to be careful. We cannot allow unfounded allegations to damage trust. We take safety very seriously, he said, while leaving it clear that people who volunteer to be part of trouble are rarely rewarded for it. They ended the meeting by asking me to sign a short note confirming that I had raised my concerns and that they had been heard. The wording said nothing about what would be done next. It simply recorded that a conversation had taken place. I read it twice, then put my name down anyway. If I was going to be part of the file, I wanted it to be because I had spoken, not because I had stayed quiet. Walking back through the corridor, I could feel the shape of that note following me down the stairs. It was the first time my name had appeared in any document about the derailment outside a tick box. I was no longer just the person who signed that the brakes had been checked. I was also the person who had said, years later, that something about the record did not sit right. Once my name sat in a file as someone who had raised concerns, a strange calm settled in. The worst part, I had always thought, would be stepping over the line between knowing and speaking. Now that I had done it, the fear shifted. It was no longer about whether I would be noticed. It was about what I would do the next time the system offered me a chance to make myself small. The answer came sooner than I expected. A few weeks after the meeting, a union representative stopped me in the corridor and asked if I had a minute. We stepped into an empty briefing room with plastic chairs and a stale smell of instant soup. He said that relatives of one of the derailment victims, along with a lawyer they had hired, were collecting statements from staff who had been on the line. My instinct was to say that I had already spoken to the company, that there was nothing more to add. He nodded as if he had expected that answer, and then told me that my internal note had already found its way into wider circulation. If the families requested access to relevant documents, my name would be one of the ones they saw. The choice, he said, was not between being visible and invisible anymore. It was between speaking directly or being spoken about at a distance. He laid a thin folder on the table between us. Inside was a draft witness statement. It summarized what I had already told the safety office in bland legal language, then left space for me to add anything I believed was important. At the bottom was a line for a signature and a date. Next to it, in smaller print, were a few words about the possibility of being called as a witness if an inquiry or civil case ever went further. I read it slowly. The text did not accuse anyone by name. It did not say procedures had been deliberately falsified. It simply set out that a member of staff had later discovered that their initials had been used to support a narrative of full compliance, and that other documents suggested unresolved questions about braking, speed, and ignored warnings. It was an honest version of what I had already admitted to myself. The rep did not try to persuade me. He pointed out practical things instead, that pensions and protections were such that the union would not be able to shield me from everything. that cases like this faded away after years of grinding without any result. His question, when it finally came, was simple. Did I want my silence to be the reason nothing changed? I thought about the man with the suitcase, sitting in our coaches year after year, carrying his archive like a private inquiry that never found a public forum. I thought about the curve in the track and the photocopied checklist with my initials on it. Most of all, I thought about the version of myself who would have to live with whichever decision I made in that plastic chair. In the end, there was no dramatic speech. I picked up the pen, corrected a factual detail about my job title on the form, and signed my name in the space provided. The letters looked smaller than usual. On the way out, I asked the rep to send me a copy for my own records. If I was going to stand inside a story, I wanted to see the exact shape of the lines that bound me to it. A few days later, I took another step I could not easily undo. I wrote a short letter to the address listed for the family solicitor, enclosing a copy of my internal note and confirming that I was willing to be contacted if they needed clarification. I simply stated that I had concerns about how certain pre-accident warnings and checklists had been used in the narrative of the derailment, and that I believed it was fair for the families to know that dropping the envelope into the post box outside the station felt oddly similar to closing up a train for departure. The action was small. The route ahead of it was long and invisible to me. I went back inside, checked my roster, and prepared for another night shift on the same line whose past I had just chosen to step into more deeply. The job did not change overnight. Passengers asked ordinary questions about arrival times and connections. Managers worried about delays more than about ghosts in the paperwork. But under the noise of announcements and wheels on rails, there was now another track running, one that began with a brown suitcase, ran through a line in a logbook, and led to a signature that might one day be read out in a room I had never seen. I did not know whether any inquiry would be reopened, whether any apology would be rewritten, whether the man who had carried the archive would ever be found or named properly in the story. All I knew was that when someone eventually laid the files on a table and tried to understand how this railway had handled its worst night, they would find my name in more than one place. For once, it would be there because I had chosen it. The first sign that my signature had left the orbit of our own paperwork was a company email to all staff on the line. It landed midweek between rota updates and a reminder about uniforms, and told us that any questions about the derailment should go to corporate communications. There was a sentence about the importance of speaking with one voice. Reading it, I could not tell whether that voice included mine or was trying to drown it out. Doors still needed closing. People still argued about seat reservations. A colleague who usually warmed a night shift with stories about management broke off when the derailment year came too close. Another caught up with me in the galley and asked if it was true that I had got involved with some old case. I told him only that I had been asked for information and had given it. He nodded, glanced over his shoulder, and said he hoped it would not come back on me. The union notice board sprouted its own paragraph. Representatives were liaising with legal advisors about requests for documents from families connected to past incidents. Support was available if they were approached directly. Reading it, I understood that my internal note and witness statement had not stayed in the small rooms, and that my name now sat inside a package of papers someone outside the company had formally asked to see. A few days later, I was invited to what HR called a welfare check. The room had glass panels in the door, 2 chairs and a box of tissues. Mostly there were phrases. They asked how I was sleeping and whether colleagues were treating me fairly. Then they shifted, gently, to the part that mattered. The company had clear procedures for historic incidents. It was important not to speculate in front of passengers or the media. Speaking to third parties without guidance could lead to misunderstandings. They laid out the ground they preferred me to stand on, then waited. At the end of the meeting, they asked if I had any concerns I wanted to raise. I said I would let them know if I needed support. Back on the platform, I stood between the staff entrance and the stairs with the welfare leaflet in my hand, thinking less about stress management than about what I would regret more in 10 years. having stayed in the file as a silent tick, or having become the kind of name people lowered their voices around. It leaked along seams. A driver I had known for years started calling me lawyer's friend with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Another colleague caught my arm one night and said his brother had died in a smaller accident on another line. He thanked me for at least trying, then walked away before I could answer. From the family's side, the contact was quieter. An email came from the solicitor's office acknowledging receipt of my statement and the letter I had sent. They said they might need to ask further questions, that they appreciated my willingness to assist, and that there was no guarantee of any particular outcome. It was the most honest line anyone had offered me since this began. Passengers remained unaware. They complained about delayed connections and overpriced sandwiches, not about forms or brake tests or ticks in boxes. To them, I was just another middle-aged conductor walking the aisle with a punch and a handheld device. Now it felt like a kind of cover I shared with the version of myself that only existed in files and meeting notes. Each time the derailment cropped up in a training module or a safety briefing, it sounded different in my ears. The narrator still spoke about procedures being followed and tragedy striking despite best efforts, but there was a pause when they reached lessons learned. I could not tell if that pause belonged to the recording or to me. Either way, I heard it. By then it was clear that the life I had before I opened that suitcase was not coming back. The trains would keep running or be cut. The company would keep talking about safety. The families would keep pushing for answers. My part in all of that would not be erased. The only question left was how I wanted to live with it. Not long after the welfare meeting, 2 envelopes arrived on the same day. One slid through my home letterbox with the Morning Post. The other waited in my work pigeonhole beside rosters and timetable changes. The home envelope carried the logo of the solicitor's office. Their letter was brief and direct. They thanked me for my statement, said they were reviewing material, and asked whether I would be willing to do a more detailed interview if an inquiry or a hearing moved forward. They made no promises, only wanted to know if my willingness still stood when the request became more concrete. The work envelope held a different kind of offer. Inside was a letter from management, written in the distancing language of human resources. It acknowledged the challenging context created by renewed attention to the derailment and recognized the strain on staff who had been on the line. The company was prepared. It said, to discuss adjustments, temporary reassignment to a different route, redeployment to a day shift away from the night line, even early retirement packages for staff approaching the natural end of their service. None of it was presented as pressure, but life might be smoother if certain people were no longer walking the coaches. That night, at my kitchen table with both letters side by side, I understood the shape of my choice. On the left lay a path that would keep my name in a process. On the right lay a path that would let me spend fewer nights thinking about brake tests and curves and fade into the same background I had lived in for most of my career. The idea of slipping into a quieter shift on some other route, counting tickets on trains that had never rolled through that battered curve, had appeal. But every time I imagined signing the retirement form, I saw the man with the suitcase sitting in a compartment across from me, papers stacked neatly inside a shell the railway treated as lost property. He had traveled this line without giving up, even when nobody wanted to hear what he carried. Walking away now, at the hint that I might be more trouble than I was worth, felt like helping the system file him away for good. The solicitor's letter did not promise justice or even progress. It simply offered me the chance to be available when someone outside the company wanted to know how things had looked from my end of the train. Saying yes would mean more waiting, more uncertainty, and the possibility of being called to explain myself in rooms that made the welfare office look friendly. In the end, the decision came down to where I could stand without losing what little respect I still had for myself. I wrote back to the solicitor first. I told them that my willingness to assist had not changed, that I understood there might be no hearing, and that I was prepared to be interviewed in more detail if they or any future inquiry required it. I kept the phrases plain. It was the line I could live with. I replied to the company. I thanked them for outlining the options. I said I intended, for now, to remain on my current route and shift pattern. I added one sentence that surprised even me when I saw it on the screen, that continuing to work the night line felt, in its own way, like part of how I was trying to carry my share of what had happened on it. Management reminded me that the offer stood if my situation changed. Colleagues raised their eyebrows when they heard about early retirement packages and asked if I was tempted. I told them I had decided to stay on. Some looked impressed. Others looked puzzled. A few just looked tired. I still checked doors and tickets. I still walked past the point on the line where, years earlier, a night run had torn itself apart. The difference now was that I did so knowing that my name sat not only on an old brake test form but also on a growing stack of documents that told a more complicated story. On other shifts, that knowledge felt like a rail to hold on to, whatever came of the family's efforts, whether an inquiry was ever reopened or not. I had at least chosen which side of the narrative I would stand on when someone else finally laid all the papers out on the table. By the time the company began serious discussions about cutting back the nightline altogether, I was no longer afraid of being known as the conductor who had talked. The fear had thinned into something sparser, the awareness that, when the story of this railway's worst night and its long shadow was told, my name would be read aloud in more than one register. I could not control the tone of the voice that spoke it, only which of my choices it referred to. By the time anything that could be called an outcome reached me, winter had settled onto the line again. The emails arrived first. One morning, there was a circular from the safety department summarizing developments and external reviews. It did not name the derailment, but the dates and the stretch of track were unmistakable. The message explained that, after consideration of new material from families and staff, the regulator had decided not to reopen a public inquiry. Instead, they issued additional recommendations. Speed restrictions on certain curves were to be made permanent rather than temporary measures. Brake testing procedures were to be documented in more detail. Training modules would be updated to emphasize fatigue, informal shortcuts, and the way normalizations could add up. No one was named in the circular. No one was blamed. A separate message came from the union. That one mentioned families directly. It thanked members who had provided information and acknowledged that, for those hoping for a reckoning, the outcome might feel thin. It listed modest gains, clearer wording on near-miss reporting, a commitment to involving union safety reps earlier when technical concerns were raised, some protection for members who refused to sign off on checklists they were not satisfied with. At the bottom was a line about staff who had come forward, sometimes many years after events, to help establish a fuller picture. On paper, that fuller picture still left blank spaces. The regulator had not ordered the company to apologize again. No one was marched out of a glass office in handcuffs. The curve did not become a monument. It acquired a permanent speed board and a few paragraphs in training materials. For the families, I suspected, the changes must have looked small against what had been taken from them. The man with the suitcase never reappeared. Somewhere along the process, his name made its way back to me through a union note and then through a shorter one from the solicitor. He had lost a daughter in the derailment and had spent years requesting documents, attending meetings and collecting every scrap of paper the railway generated about that night. He had died quietly at home 2 winters before I thought to open his case. The image I carried of him in the corridor, turning sideways to let me pass, had been one of his last normal journeys. Knowing that did not change any document in any file. It did change the way I walked through the coaches. When I checked tickets on the nightline now, I found myself counting people traveling alone with nothing but a battered bag and a fixed expression. I still did my job. I made small talk when it seemed needed. But underneath, There was a standing awareness that some passengers were carrying more than luggage, and that I would almost never know what was in their hands. Inside the company, the fallout stayed mostly polite. I was never disciplined. No one cut my hours. The offer of redeployment remained on the table for a while, then expired as staffing needs shifted. At the same time, certain conversations rearranged themselves around my presence. People still joked about management and timetables. They stopped using the word derailment as a punchline when I was within earshot. Once, after a long shift, a driver who had been on the railway longer than I had sat down beside me in the mess room and said he had read a summary of the regulator's decision. He did not say whether he thought it went far enough. He remarked that at least, buried in the appendices, there was a sentence acknowledging that fatigue, normalized shortcuts, and internal pressures had played a part. As for me, the most tangible change in my day-to-day life was a small one. In the revised training pack for new recruits, there was a section on the derailment with a note about additional testimony from onboard staff leading to updates in procedure. It did not name me. It did not have to. Standing at the back of the room during one of those sessions, watching a group of younger conductors frown at the slide, I felt a complicated mix of shame, relief, and something close to peace. The accident had not been undone. No inquiry had rewritten the past. The family still lived with empty seats that no advisory or speed board could fill. The railway still wanted, above all, to keep moving. Yet somewhere between the internal report and the file the family solicitor now held, there was a thin, fragile line of connection between what I had ticked on a form years ago and what I was willing to say out loud now. That line was hardly visible from a distance. For me, it was enough to keep working without feeling that every mile of track under my feet was built on a lie. By the time the line lost its night service, a few years had passed. The decision came in another worded announcement: changes in travel patterns, long-term cost pressures, a need to reconfigure capacity. None of the emails mentioned the derailment. They did not need to. Everyone who had worked that stretch heard the gap in the phrasing and filled it in themselves. On my last night run over the curve, I kept my routine as straight as I could. Tickets, berths, quiet words in the corridor for anyone who looked especially tired or lost. The permanent speedboard stood beside the track like it had always been there. From inside the train, nothing about the landscape announced itself as a site of tragedy. It was just another piece of railway the timetable allowed us to see only in darkness. After we cleared the curve, I walked to the service compartment and opened the locker where I kept my notebooks. I had been told I did not need to hold on to my copies. The formal record existed in safer places now. Still, I kept a slim folder of printouts and letters, my statement, a redacted version of the regulator's summary, a short note from one of the families that said very little about the case and a lot about their daughter's smile. I flipped through the pages without reading them. The important part was not in the wording anymore. It was in the fact that these documents existed, that somewhere beyond this locker there were people who had read them and argued over them. Somewhere in a training database, a bullet point about late testimony from onboard staff now sat beside the old phrases about procedures followed. That was not justice. But it was not nothing. After the night line shut, I stayed with the company on a daytime suburban route. The younger conductors knew me as the older guy who was good with rostering quirks and paperwork. A couple of them also knew, from training or gossip, that my name appeared in connection with an old derailment case. When I did talk, I avoided the temptation to turn it into a heroic story. I did not present myself as the man who had blown the whistle and changed the industry. In truth, by the time I spoke, the families had already done most of the heavy lifting for years. I told the younger ones that what I had done was closer to keeping a small promise very late, signing my name where it should have been from the start, then trying to live the rest of my shifts in a way that did not contradict that. The story had traveled further than the network map. A safety newsletter cited a case in which late staff testimony helped prompt changes in braking procedures. In the reference list at the end, among reports and regulations, there was a line crediting first-hand evidence from onboard crew. The man with the suitcase existed in those references only indirectly. His daughter's name appeared in the summaries. His own remained in the family's correspondence and in the union's memory of who had come to every meeting. For me, he stayed in the image of that last evening I had seen him, standing in the doorway of his berth, one hand on the strap of his case, making space in the corridor without complaint. When I thought about the derailment now, I did not only see the curve or my initials on a form, I saw places where someone could have chosen to look a little closer and had not, myself included. I also saw a narrower set of places where, finally, someone had. The gap between those two sets would never close completely, but it was smaller than it had been. On some mornings, I still woke before dawn with the sensation of the night train under my feet. Those days, if my shift started later, I walked down to the newer station that served the old line. The night service was gone, but commuter trains passed over the curve in daylight now. Passengers looking out of the windows saw trees, noise barriers, maybe a glimpse of rooftops. They did not see the file, or the forms, or the man with the case. They did not see me. That felt right. Not every truth needs a plaque. It was enough that, somewhere in the safety briefings and the private archives of families who refused to forget, the story now existed in a form a little closer to what happened. My name sat in those pages quietly, not as a warning or a legend, just as part of the record. When I finally leave the railway altogether, the trains will keep moving without me. The curve will still be there, and so will the paper trail that says we learned something from it, even if what we learned arrived years after it should have.